Look, I'm not gonna lie to you, a lot of Movie Time games are bad. Like, really bad.
We're all gonna die.
Like, caused the gaming industry to completely crash and burn bad. Often given a low budget, a lack of creative freedom, and almost certainly rushed to release the same time as the film, the developers often had the odds very much not in their favour. However, as I'm sure most of you are aware, there are also lots of very, very good movie tie-in games, such as the early Harry Potter games and Pixar games, just to name a few. So why is that? And why is it that they basically stopped making them altogether at a certain point? Let's have a little look, shall we? If you're new here, I play and review a whole bunch of games from my childhood, where most tend to be licensed games. Check out some of my reviews and other vids if you wanna, like and subscribe if you want to see some more, and come and watch me play either here or on Twitch in the future. That wasn't my fault.
Oh my god.
That was iconic. Here, I'm going to look at licensed games, but with a focus on movie tie-in games. Movie tie-ins are somewhat more restricted by release date than licensed games in general. A lot of licensed games, and indeed normal games, could have a target of releasing, say, around Christmas time, but there's always a bit of leeway, like, oh, let's just push it back to summer, why not? But with movie tie-ins, they're pretty much tied completely to the film's release date, for obvious reasons. Like, no offense, but no one cares about playing The Chronicles of Narnia Prince Caspian on the Nintendo DS 6 months later. Some games even come out a month or two before the film comes up, presumably to drive up the hype for the film. Rarely, you even get some games that come out years after the film, such as GoldenEye coming out 2 years after the film's release, although conveniently around the time of the film's sequel. Sometimes you even get spin-off games like The Nightmare Before Christmas, Oogie's Revenge, coming out in 2005, when the original film was released 12 years prior, without a game of its own. Before we have a look at some of the ways in which these movie tie-in and license games succeed, let's see how they can fail. The bad, and the ugly. Now, I'm by no means an expert, and a lot of these ideas I formed from the 2 brain cells rattling around in my skull, so definitely take some of it with a grain of salt. One main reason that a lot of movie tie-in games are pretty bad in quality is the short time and low budget they are often given. A lot of movie studios or rights holders probably only see video games as an extra promotional tool, and so would only be willing to put down a relatively small amount of money for development, and to be honest, I don't blame them. The small budget, plus the restrictive amount of time to make the game, often leaves developers with little choice but to fall back on easy to replicate genres like platformers or minigame collections. A lot of games will have poorly controlling characters because of a lack of time to finesse things like jumping or cameras. There may be a lot of copy pasting, repeated levels, and often cut content that the developers just didn't have the time or the scope to flesh out. Speaking of scope, the studios obviously want to make a game that will appeal to as wide an audience as possible, especially with kids movies, so creativity is probably put on hold in favour of things like putting in as many characters from the film as possible.
Well, hello down there.
I like raspberry!
Another thing that sometimes happens with movie tie-ins is copying kinda trendy game genres. For example, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire game, released in 2005 by EA, inexplicably goes for a more hack and slash action kinda style than the more free-roaming adventure style of the previous games. Devil May Cry, released in 2001, was an extremely popular and well-received game that made popular the stylish action style. A kinda hack and slashy kinda style, but I know people will get mad if I say it's hack and slash, so... EA Games then went on to produce The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, action-adventure games that heavily made use of hack and slash style mechanics, individual levels, and in the case of the latter, local multiplayer. Seeing as how well those games did, it's no surprise that EA wanted Harry Potter to jump on that train, especially with the films becoming more dark and serious in nature with each entry, but as I'm sure we're all aware, that didn't turn out too great.
Back again, eh?
More beans!
Will you stop going on about beans, Ron?
Interestingly, it also came out very recently from Kim Salzer, EA's Director of Product Marketing from 2000 to 2003, that a Harry Potter MMO was being considered, but ultimately the idea was shot down by EA, who didn't believe that IP would last more than a few years. Imagine Harry Potter not lasting more than a few years. Imagine imagine EA making a single correct decision. Maybe not so much reason for their demise, but definitely something that probably doesn't help with their overall perception is that, let's be honest, critics don't really like licensed games, it seems. Although critics' thoughts are not going to heavily influence Barbara, who needs to buy little Timmy a colourful video game of his favourite film Ants on Game Boy Color for Christmas, they probably haven't helped with the overall opinion of licensed games as inferior. However, this idea of licensed and movie tie-in games being generally worse doesn't ring true for all licensed games. The case for licensed games. Oh, well, now we've got all that negativity over, let's have a look at some great licensed and movie tie-in games. Obviously, I'm going to bring up the early Harry Potter games. Oh, not that one. As fantastic licensed games that not only were solid games, but truly captured the magic, pun intended, of exploring Hogwarts. Although I don't have the figures for how much the games cost to make, I think it's not wrong to suggest that they probably had a higher budget than a lot of other licensed games, with full voice acting, impressive graphical effects, and beautiful, fully orchestrated music. The first game sold incredibly well, with the various platforms selling millions of copies, and the PC version being the third best-selling PC game of 2001 in North America, despite being released only 2 months before the end of the year. These high sales figures probably persuaded EA to splash a bit more cash on them in the future, leading to games with increased scope and exploration, and even hiring some of the actors from the films to record audio for the game. The Lord of the Rings games, oh, not that one, are another great example of games coming from an extremely popular film series, and therefore being granted the luxury of containing THX certified audio, music taken directly from the film score, and insanely good graphics with gigantic battle sequences, something not being given to the game of the first book, I'll tell ya. This is bloody empty. This brings up another small but important issue. While some games had limited rights to content from either the books or the films alone, the Lord of the Rings games being a good example, Harry Potter had the advantage of taking content from both the books and the films, hence why we get Peeves making frequent appearances in the games, despite not featuring in the films even once. Another factor that I think is key is the unique relationships film and video game studios have with each other. One great example is the partnership between Disney Interactive and Traveller's Tales. Starting in 1994 with the release of Mickey Mania on the SNES, Sega Genesis and Sega CD, Disney was so impressed with Traveller's Tales' faithful and animated portrayal of Mickey Mouse, they scrapped a sequel and bumped up Traveller's Tales to produce a game for the upcoming Toy Story film. Thus began a fruitful friendship, where Traveller's Tales would go on to produce games for A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, Toy Story Racer, Finding Nemo, and The Weakest Link.
Let's play The Weakest Link.
Oh, sorry, that's not Disney, that shouldn't be here. A Bug's Life and Toy Story 2 I think still hold up very much to this day, partly due to their fully explorable level designs, and I imagine Traveller's Tales would have been granted increased creative freedom by Disney with each game, as they had definitely proved themselves as more than capable of producing a decent movie tie-in. Another fun part of movie tie-in and licensed games is the inclusion of extra content. A lot of the time, rewards for completing levels or challenges were clips of the film, behind the scenes footage, or concept art for the game, content that would not have been easily accessible online at the time. Nowadays, watching a 5x10 pixel blurry mess of the film is less appealing, but back at the day, wow. If you didn't own the film on VHS, this was one of the only easy ways of seeing bits from the film. Licensed games also often have content invented for the game that is not lifted from the film, book, or other source materials. For example, the Harry Potter games have a number of spells that I think were not invented by the Grand High Witch herself, not from the books or films, but that have cemented themselves into people's view of the world, like what spell would you cast to push stuff if not Flabendo? I think because of the overall mixed or negative response licensed games often have, when a good one shows up it can really shine. Like after the disasters that were The Simpsons Wrestling and The Simpsons Skateboarding, I don't think anyone was expecting The Simpsons Hit and Run to appear. A fantastic GTA inspired romp through an open world Springfield, with contributions from the original writers and cast. For me, the game takes on a more absurd style of comedy than the show, not least due to the wacky physics and disjointed voiceovers. I think it's so funny. Honestly, what a good game.
Oh, he's gone, he's gone!
However, all was not well in the world of licensed games. The fall and future of licensed games. whatever happened to movie tie-in games? It seems like nowadays, despite films making more money than ever, you hardly ever see a corresponding console version anymore. One big answer is that it just became less and less financially viable to produce proper games for every animated kids film. Back in the 90s and 2000s, video games were often made by small teams, but as consoles increased in complexity and capability, larger and larger teams would be required to produce often below average games that was starting to sell less and less well. One example of a fatality of the decline in licensed games is THQ, whose stock price dropped from more than $30 to 11 cents in just 6 years. The video game market shifted dramatically, with companies less willing to spend middling amounts on multiple games, and instead spending huge budgets of tens of millions of dollars on single AAA games designed to be appealing to a large audience. And who can blame them? After the financial crisis, who would be willing to slowly let all their money leak away on experimental, innovative games that could potentially make no money? Licensed games didn't disappear completely, however. As the video game market dramatically changed with the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, licensed video games found a new home as smartphones became more and more mainstream and eventually found their way into the hands of children when "Mummy just needs to lie down, go play on this for a bit, Oliver." Smartphones were a lot quicker and cheaper to develop games for, they contain easy revenue makers like microtransactions, and importantly, if they failed, no problem, just slap a new IP on top and release yet another Candy Crush clone. However, all is not yet lost for console licensed games. In recent years, we have had some examples of licensed games, even if not made for a specific film release. For example, Insomniac Games' 2018 Spider-Man was a highly successful and well-reviewed game, inspired by the wide Spider-Man comic book series and surrounding media, selling over 13 million copies and being the fastest selling third-party game on a Sony console ever. It's also kind of a spiritual successor to 2004's Spider-Man 2 on PS2, a game remembered for its sprawling, realistic Manhattan and incredible physics-based web swinging. A sequel to the 2018 game came in 2020 with Spider-Man Miles Morales, showing that licensed games were not only not dead, but also still extremely popular with gamers. Other licensed games have had less success. 2020's Marvel Avengers received mixed reviews, with Destructoid describing it as slightly above average and simply inoffensive. I also often hear people talking about how they would love remakes of some of these old games, but unfortunately, due to complex licensing rights between developers, publishers, and the original content owners, this is often a more costly process than would ever be recovered from sales of an early 2000s game. However, it does occasionally happen. SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated is a 2020 remake of the original console game from 2003, and while receiving mixed reviews, was extremely popular with fans and sold pretty well, with 2 million copies sold and a sequel in the works. It's also not over for Traveller's Tales. After working closely with Disney for a number of years, they moved on to creating the LEGO series of video game adaptations of film series, including Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Marvel. They also show no signs of stopping, with a new LEGO Star Wars game, The Skywalker Saga, coming out in 2022. And that leads to the question of, what next? What direction could licensed games possibly take next? Well, I'm not one to predict the future, but I think licensed games are likely to continue their current trend of games not attached to specific entries in film series, but more general franchise games. And I do think this makes sense. It does make games more timeless after all. We already have Hogwarts Legacy coming out in 2022, 3, 4, and whether or not it will be any good or not, it does slot nicely into the ever-expanding Wizarding world. I personally would love to see an old licensed game or two, like Hit and Run, being remade or a sequel produced. Let's just hope they don't try to remake some older licensed games, eh?
You are the weakest link. Goodbye.